Welcome to the European Dialogue podcast, where we explore the ideas, challenges, and voices shaping Europe today. Earlier this year, I met with Nils Luyten and Sevda Kilicalp from PHILEA, the Philanthropy Europe Association, just as public debate was growing around the influence of philanthropy on democratic life. The headlines at that time had included J.K. Rowling's £70,000 donation to For Women Scotland, following a UK Supreme Court ruling on transgender rights, a moment that highlighted how philanthropic giving can directly shape legal interpretations, public discourse, and the rule of law. Nils and Sevda work on the PHILEA Democracy Network, a growing community of foundations across Europe committed to supporting or exploring work in democracy. The network fosters inspiration, dialogue, and collaboration around the urgent question: how do we move from defending democracy to developing it? In this episode, we discuss their new report titled 2025 Democracy Briefer for Funders: What's Happening with European Democracy and What Funders Can Do About It. It's a timely and practical guide for those seeking to strengthen democratic values in a rapidly changing Europe. PHILEA represents over 7,500 public benefit foundations across more than 30 countries and is united by a shared vision to co-shape a just, resilient and pluralistic society that centres on people and planet. Through knowledge sharing, collective action and a commitment to inclusion and transparency, PHILEA is helping philanthropy rise to the challenges of our time. So let's get into it. Welcome to the show, Sevda and Nils.
Oh, thank you for having us.
I'd like to start with you, Sevda, if okay, to understand more about the key argument in your research. You report that democracy over time has not been weakened through dramatic events, but is actually observed through slower legal changes. Could you share an example of what that really looks and feels like in Europe today?
Sure. I will give you the best known example from Europe. Of course, it will be Hungary. So everyone can easily follow the historical events while focusing on these tactics. Orban's approach to dismantling democracy has been gradual, legalistic, and institutionally embedded. This makes it especially difficult to counter because he didn't break the system, but he rewired it from within. One of the primary tools has been manipulation of the legal and constitutional framework. After Fidesz, the political party, gained 2/3 of the parliamentary majority in 2010, the government rewrote the constitution and passed hundreds of new laws, often without meaningful debate. These changes weakened the judiciary, lowered the retirement age of judges to remove critics, and curtailed the power of constitutional courts. A second major tool has been control of media. Independent outlets were bought by the government-aligned businesses, and then these were funneled into centralized pro-government foundations. And the editorial lines are coordinated. Public media acts as more like a state propaganda machine than a neutral news source. In this way, they created an information monopoly that leaves little room for dissenting voices. Another tool strategy was to close civic space, again, using legal and administrative pressures. So NGOs, especially receiving foreign funding, were forced to register as foreign agents. And these steps didn't really outlaw civil society completely, but created a kind of an hostile legal environment that intimidates and isolates and restricts critical voices. Academic freedoms as well targeted, mostly through the expulsion of the Central European University and the government takeover of university boards. Another key strategy was this subtle electoral manipulation. So the elections still happen, but they look competitive. But in fact, the playing field is kind of staged. Like the Fidesz political party redrew electoral districts in its favor. It changed the voting system to reward the largest party. The state resources are used for campaigning, and public broadcasters give disproportionate airtime to the ruling party. Final tool I would like to mention, Orban has consolidated, of course, the executive power by undermining horizontal oversight, the government has weakened independent institutions, and emergency powers introduced during COVID, and these were further centralized authority in the hands of the prime minister and really with minimal parliamentary control. So each of these tools has been used under the banner of legality, and this created a system where democratic form in fact exists, but the democratic substance is in a way eroded.
Indeed. Hungary is probably the most obvious example we have when it comes to thinking within the EU as to how democracy can be eroded, but then under that banner of legality, as you put it. So drawing then on both of your expertise in PHILEA, philanthropy isn't usually the first thing people might think about when it comes to defending democracy. Nils, this time perhaps you can tell us, why is it so important and how can private funders really make a difference?
So if anything, I feel that public discourse, especially the last few days, skews more towards seeing philanthropy as a threat to democracy. So the unelected rich, elected rich deciding our laws. The example, J.K. Rowling just spent £70,000 supporting a court case against the Scottish government, and as a result, women are now defined by biological sex under equalities law. So this sort of public discourse makes foundations in our membership question if they even have the legitimacy to be involved in supporting democracy. And of course, we can make a whole side point about philanthropy isn't just the rich. So there's a lot of community foundations that are on the rise. There's transnational giving by individuals. So it's not just the story of the rich. So that said, the statement that you hear often in this context is that in an ideal world, we wouldn't need charity because the government would take care of everyone. And philanthropic money instead should be taxed. And that would mean bigger budgets, public budgets in the hands of elected officials. And don't get me wrong, I'm a big fan of taxing high incomes more. But that said, from my own experience of working with governments for a decade, is you cannot and you should not trust your government to always do the right thing. We need independent watchdogs, or we need organizations campaigning for policy reform, and they need to be independent. If they were 100% funded by public funds, there is no independence, and they would be at risk of punishment. And there's a good example, again, from recent days, is that the European People's Party attacked environmental NGOs, suggesting that their public funding should be cut because that would stop them from allegedly lobbying against the policies of the European Parliament. And the objective with that attack is clearly to weaken NGOs, and it is to dampen the crucial voices of civil society in our democracy. So secondly, governments are just people. They are just groups of people. And that means that there are, in many cases, voices and communities that are wildly underrepresented. This causes major blind spots. And this also causes politicians to be under constant pressure to conform to the voice of the majority. And as a result, the policies made by our governments often leave others behind. So rural areas are overlooked because they aren't of economic interest. Or in my case, I live with an artist who is struggling with the whole AI crisis, but for most people working in the governments, they don't have a feel for what that means. There's a blind spot there. On top of all the minorities, that are not represented, that leads to these communities not getting the services they need. So again, philanthropy in that case is a necessity because it can fill these gaps that governments are structurally not really incentivized to fill. And lastly, within the philanthropic community, there's a lot of worry about non-neutrality. So to those, I would say funding democracy, in my opinion, it's not a case of funding left versus right. It is not about supporting a specific party, but it is about supporting democratic health. So that means, an independent civil society, pro-democratic movements, organizations, watchdogs, independent media, as Sevda already mentioned. So it's about improving the sense of community and that social fabric. So again, it's not a question of should philanthropy be involved in safeguarding democracy or innovating it. No, it's that it's a necessary condition that we have to have another independent source of income for civic society.
Yeah, I like the way you described it there as a necessity for supporting our democratic health and the social fabric. In the report, I believe you described the democratic backsliding that Sev just touched on earlier, using an iceberg metaphor, so showing those deep root causes below and those visible symptoms then above. Can you talk to deeper drivers and whether you think some of those might have been overlooked in mainstream debates?
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to come in with only 3 years of experience in the philanthropic field, so let that be a disclaimer. But from my experience, the last 2 years since I joined PHILEA, is that I feel there is a disconnect between mainstream philanthropic debate on democracy versus what drives people's votes. Just from yesterday, a report that came out around the last municipal elections in Belgium. It was the first time that we had non-compulsory voting, so you didn't have to go vote. As a result, half of the youth stayed home, way more than experts predicted. And a major contributor to people staying home was apparently their socioeconomic situation. So people with lower income stayed home. Also, people who didn't necessarily have a lower income, but who stated that they were worried about their economic situation and their livelihood, despite all that, they stayed home. We also saw in the latest European election that what motivated voters, so even when they went to vote, the biggest motivation of their choice was housing and the cost of living. So that is so at odds that socioeconomic inequality seems to be one of the biggest factors that charts the course of our democratic future. Yet, even within PHILEA, with our large membership, we don't have a dedicated network to tackling socioeconomic justice. I also see within our existing networks, many strategies on how to improve democratic health are focused on convincing voters, or they're stuck in thinking from one election to the next. You know, how can we convince people that our policies are the right ones? How can we debunk their opinions? How can we increase voter turnouts in certain groups? Or how should we promote a European identity? You know, all those things are good, and they're valid questions, and it's something that you can also tackle. But what I then feel is missing is that socioeconomic inequality, which is at the root of many of these dynamics, is so overlooked. And a reason for that, one of the reasons could be that there is a lack of diversity in the philanthropic sector, and the diversity is even less so, the more you move up in the foundation. So at some point in the level of the boards, even less so. And I'm not talking about just socioeconomic, sociocultural diversity. I'm talking about a lack of people with lived experience. So I grew up in social housing. I lived off social welfare until I was 25. I didn't go to any of these fancy European schools. That's no one's individual fault. Everyone's story is different. Everyone's experience is different, but it does come with a lack of understanding of the mindset of someone who's struggling financially to make ends meet. So it's improving, but there's a lot of work ahead of us in the philanthropic sector. So there's a lot more voices being included, but we're far off. And as a result, this leads to some of these questions that I hear about: why are people voting away their rights? Why do these anti-democratic parties receive so many votes, but in my real, life, I don't seem to encounter these people? To me, that's strange. These are the people that, I'm around all the time. This is the mindset that I used to have myself. I was a nationalist voter in times where I was financially struggling because I was just frustrated and angry. So it comes to this hierarchy of needs, right? If you are feeling unsafe or insecure in your situation, whether that's physical, but in this case, economical, you don't care about self-actualization or morals. So by not addressing socioeconomic hardship, but then preaching morality, European unity, doing the right thing for democracy, it just feels patronizing, and it just feels more anger. And then a second root cause is that there's many systemic issues in how we run democracy. So, and it's getting worse. So rule of law is on the decline. We have short election cycles that are really at odds with the long-term policies that we need for these crises that we're facing. And let's be frank, many foundations in our membership were set up to fund something easy and non-contentious, like a public park or a school. Reducing taxes while improving my brand through charity work, great. But on the flip side, we have most of these anti-democratic foundations, like the Heritage Foundation, that are set up by idealists that have a very clear goal to undermine democracy and in their personal favor, and they are throwing huge amounts of money at the wall and seeing it sticks with little due diligence. And it reminds me, and you'll catch me on a Game of Thrones quote because I am a nerd after all, is that these anti-democratic actors and foundations, they know the potential consequences of reckless action, but they do them anyway, because that means that they don't intend to suffer any of these consequences in the first place. And that's what we're up against. So we are up against that with less money, with much less passionate pro-democratic ideology in our boards. We are burdened by, at times, I would say, way too heavy self-imposed due diligence out of concern for backlash or loss of image. Valid, though, but in the case of family members on the board, even afraid of losing privacy. So my main message there is whether your foundation was created to fund climate or school or education or arts, guess what? A non-functioning democracy is bad for business, whichever the business is, and you will soon hit that wall of authoritarianism, no matter what field you're in. So you better start funding democracy. Otherwise, might as well throw money in the pit.
Yeah, you heard it here first. No, not to really make light of this situation. It sounds like the very foundations of PHILEA are being tested, and what a challenge for your organization, indeed. It's just a tricky landscape, isn't it? Because, well, we see what you've just described kind of echoed in politics today, where the dominant approach often seems to be like, say anything now and apologize later. Unfortunately, that kind of rhetoric tends to grab more attention and airtime than the more measured voices and those that take the time to do the due diligence, as you've said. But then, those are then seen as slower to act and kind of less memorable in the public eye. So the PHILEA report, it looks at how and why younger generations and younger Europeans are increasingly dissatisfied with how democracy is working. Sevda, maybe you can come in here. Could you tell us what it is behind this trend, if it's a trend, and what does it say about the future of democratic participation?
Sure. So it's true that younger Europeans are increasingly disappointed with how democracy functions. This dissatisfaction comes from several key factors. We already mentioned economic exclusion, so high youth unemployment, inequality, limited access to housing, stability, drive really frustration. And success is often seen as tied to inherited wealth, and this also deepens generational divides further. The frustration is intensified by a sense of distance from traditional political processes, especially those from disadvantaged backgrounds feel overlooked, unheard, and excluded. Many young people are annoyed also with the slow progress in policymaking. They feel democracy is not delivering on critical issues like jobs, climate, equality. They also doubt that democracy can address these pressing issues their countries face. And some of them are even open to authoritarian alternatives, feeling the system no longer serves them. And young people's view on democracy is also shaped by growing polarization. Millennials in particular are more likely to view opponents as morally wrong and refuse to interact with them. This makes compromise and cooperation within a democratic system more difficult. Something I really find fascinating is that recent research has found a growing political divide between young men and young women, with young men, women leaning towards progressive politics, and young men increasingly supporting conservative or far-right parties. The divide emerges partly from a backlash against gender equality movements like Me Too, and the perception among some young men that diversity and inclusion initiatives disadvantage them. Young men often feel that their concerns are overlooked by mainstream politics, and this contributes to a shift towards right-wing candidates that they believe address their needs. Manosphere reinforced these views, creating echo chambers that amplify anti-feminist sentiments. And if this term is new for the listener, manosphere is an umbrella term that refers to a number of interconnected online groups promoting male supremacy and anti-feminist ideologies. So in these spaces, like toxic masculine figures like Joe Rogan thrive, gaining trust and influence among young men. Gen Z, raised in, of course, in a media landscape with vast choices of platforms like Netflix, YouTube, TikTok, and experiencing an erosion of shared experiences. So the algorithms, in fact, reinforce individual preferences but isolate users in ideological bubbles. Further to this, erosion of direct socialization between genders is also kind of worsened by excessive phone use. This limits the opportunities for really real connection and understanding each other. And so this also deepens the divide between genders and their political views. So these trends carry important implications. So if young people feel democracy doesn't represent them, they may opt out of the voting altogether. This, of course, would weaken democratic legitimacy. And disappointment with democratic systems can drive young people towards more populist and authoritarian leaders, which is already happening, because they promise these quick fixes and often at the expense of democratic norms. Young people may also may be rejecting these traditional channels of democracy, but this doesn't mean that they are completely disinterested or disengaged. Many young people still engage through protest, online activism, and grassroots movements. And it's also important to remember that there's still a chance to rebuild trust, of course, before it becomes too late. By addressing their concerns and involving them in a meaningful way, democratic actors still have the opportunity to reconnect with the younger generation.
Yeah, super interesting, especially on the erosion of shared experiences and connection being created in the media platforms that we all have available to us today. To your last point, it's good to know there is still interest and lots of opportunity then to engage this group of democracy, which is, of course, where organizations like yours come in. You mentioned their polarization, and it also it does come back to your previous points too on the dissatisfaction in democracy, which actually both of you have mentioned. And I know that your report links to this division between that and emotional drivers. So could either of you speak to that? Like, how are we seeing emotions fuel political polarization and democratic decline?
Mm-hmm. So a step back, maybe first is, and already talked about this a bit, but what fuels these emotions, right? Many of these emotions are legitimate because we've had a lot of societal transformations that have gone so rapidly that many feel left behind, or many feel that they've lost their footing or sense of belonging. The digital transformation, multiculturalism expanded really rapidly, especially in some small towns. And there is some discomfort in that is normal. We need time. People need time to adjust. So globalism, things have gotten way more complicated than they felt a few years ago. And on top of that, there's been a myriad of crises: banking crisis, COVID, climate change. All of that has increased anxiety, and that causes people to turn inward and focus on, as I said, self-preservation. And you also start to lose trust in the government because the way we've set it up, they aren't often able to tackle these issues, especially not in the short term. Any politician who says that there is an easy win-win in any of these crises is simply not telling the truth. They just want to get elected for the next term, and then whatever happens after 4 or 5 years, it's not their problem. But so feelings of frustration, loneliness, isolation, this leads to a disconnect with politics. This leads to civilian engagement in general just not being something that you have maybe even time or the privilege to think of, because you have to worry about putting bread on the table and having a roof over your head. So again, in many cases, these feelings are legitimate, but often they are misdirected at convenient targets. Part of that is just psychology, and that's where 5 years of my psychology comes into play, which I feel like I haven't been able to use for a long time. But just basic human functioning. We we tend to believe in the most simplistic solution, that our brain loves an easy solution. So, growing up in social housing, a lot of the people that didn't have access to it, that were on the waiting list, they'll see a migrant family move in next door, and then immediately, they are to blame. That is the reason I don't have a house. The less easy solution is the fact that at the time, I remember having a housing minister that said, the free market will correct itself, so social housing will just boom if business wants it. It's never been true, but that's too hard of a reality for the brain to sort of want to understand. Easy solutions, they're easier for the brain. On the other hand, we're also being willfully manipulated by others, by these populist parties, because they're doing that to spur an anti-democratic agenda. So they feed off of these emotions. People who are disconnected, they'll seek alternative means to reclaim agency. So they'll turn to, populist movements that offer a simple solution, but also an unifying narrative that is often based on us versus them. So it's very often exclusion-based. And these movements will have an emotional appeal rather than a nuanced fact-based one. Again, it's something that our brain loves, that kind of stuff. It reminded me of this Flat Earther, I think, documentary on Netflix, where what was interesting is if you really go and talk to these people, it's not so much that they really believe the Earth is flat, but it's that they found a community where for once they feel they belong. Same is true for these movements. People will start to form an entire identity around it because it makes them feel connected in ways that they have been missing. And that is a very normal human need. So nowadays, we see compelling narratives about reclaiming lost glory, make America great again, returning to simpler times where it was much better, for a very specific part of the community, definitely not for minorities, or in my case, the queer people in your community. But, that idea sells because it connects to an emotional gap, an emotional need that is not being fulfilled. So what is also dangerous about this is that increasingly there is this feeling that democracy isn't delivering for us. It's true that democracy isn't set up to solve many of the issues, as I said, but that seems to overlook the fact that we are democracy. Democracy isn't some dimension that is removed from our reality. It is us. And in all of these crises, I think there is the uncomfortable truth that we will have to give up some of our comfort. We are living above our means, but no politician wants to just simply come out and say that, because that doesn't win votes. So in this case, that is really why emotions will, they're real, they're valid, but they are being purposely misguided, and that causes the erosion of our democracy as long as we ignore them. So I think we need to focus much more on talking with people instead of talking at them. Example from my youth, if you could have come to me when I was struggling financially to make ends meet with any kinds of fact-based reports, none of it would catch, because you are frustrated and anger, and the easy solution is always more palpable. So that is why, again, I'm preaching for connecting this tissue, especially at the local level, but also that we just need positive narratives out there that are not so much about, the sort of YouTube comments, well, actually, you're wrong, because in any fight that you have with a friend or a spouse, facts are out the door, and you just, you keep going down the rabbit hole of your own truth. And so we need more positive narratives. We need less, I think, in my opinion, fact-based debunking approaches. But again, that's my opinion.
Yeah, more positive opinions would be great. We're hearing far too often this anti-immigration discourse, which is the sell, as you've put it, Nils. Sevda, how do you think, with this in mind, how do you think democratic actors and the foundations you work with even can respond to these concerns whilst ensuring that they're still remaining like true to their values of inclusion and what human rights are as well?
I think this is possible, and I can give an example to demonstrate that restricting immigration is not a necessary path to success for center-left parties or democratic forces. So in Spain and Portugal, we had such an example of West European countries where center-left parties have been re-elected after implementing progressive policies without adopting a Danish-style restrictive turn on immigration. In the case of Spain, Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez has even announced plans to make it easier for immigrants to settle in the country. He argued that Spanish society would suffer if immigration were halted due to issues like depopulation or labor shortages in various sectors. And Sanchez directly challenged anti-immigrant narratives with some facts, arguments, but also positive narratives about the benefits of immigration. So the success of the center-left in Spain and Portugal is attributed to their also record of delivering material gains for their working class supporters. So that means that focusing on policies that improve the living standards of the broader population can be also a way to gain and maintain support. So this can really mitigate the appeal of anti-immigrant sentiments that often scapegoat migrants for economic anxiety. So democratic actors can and should focus on building this inclusive society where newcomers and locals feel a strong sense of belonging and shared opportunity, rather than narrowly emphasizing migrants' rights, which can unintentionally drive anti-immigration sentiments. So by framing policies around universal values like dignity, fairness, mutual contribution, they can really promote this integration, cohesion, belonging without alienating broader segments of the society. So I think this approach really shifts the narrative from us versus them to a collective we, emphasizing that everyone benefits from a society where all individuals, regardless of origin, have a chance to thrive.
Oh, lovely. What a nice and positive way to wrap up this episode. Our final question for you both. If you had one message for funders or policymakers, and indeed our listeners who follow the work of the EU Values Network, what would it be?
So you're not going to catch me, I think, on one message. There is no golden path to funding democracy, but I think some important takeaways are you have to have a long-term vision. There is no rapid solution. We need to reconnect, and especially at the local level, we need to innovate the systemic issues in our democracy. A lot of that from the ground up, and a lot of that will take a lot of time. And I think that's something that I've learned from conversations with foundations that are, let's say, focused on research or even climate, is in their fields, there might be a lot of rapid impact that they can see. You know, I fund a specific product, it comes out, impact. In democracy, that will not be the case. You will see the results, but it will take a long time. And that's also why, strangely, you know, where most investment in democracy goes, there's still democratic backsliding because it takes a while. So it's also a critical time. And that's a message I really want to push. Urgency is needed. We need to maybe dig into endowments. We need to, for sure, activate new mission-driven philanthropists. That said, even though it's a critical time, there are so many solutions already out there. So we don't need to wait around for the best one, the one solution to emerge. There's all these kind of ways that Sevda has mentioned that you can get involved in funding democracy. So don't wait around. The time really is now. And if you are looking for peers in this field as a funder, for sure, join our Democracy Network in PHILEA. It's a great group of people that come from a very diverse angle of funding democracy. And so it's the best place to I guess, learn.
So I will a little bit echo what Nils said. So we published this report about what is driving democratic backsliding, right? Everyone is asking for a simple recipe to address these problems. However, the intention of the report, in fact, is to highlight the complexity and interconnectedness of social, political, cultural, and economic factors. So to address these challenges, in fact, we need to understand and embrace this complexity, embrace this complexity. So so this reminds me some of the key concepts from Hannah Arendt's work. In her analysis of totalitarianism, she emphasizes that political life is inherently messy, unpredictable, contingent, shaped by a multitude of factors, and she cautioned against reducing complex issues to simplistic answers, because such approaches can lead to harmful and unintended consequences. Her work also suggested that addressing these challenges requires continuous collective action that adapts to changing circumstances. I would like to call on her notion of responsibility. This calls on us to take ownership of the current state of affairs and to recognize that political systems are fragile and they can be subject to decay if we as citizens disengage or rely on top-down measures. And to conclude, I would like to say that Arendt also believed in the concept of natality, or the idea that every new generation has the potential to create something entirely new. This idea gives me the hope and strength to do things differently. So rather than trying to revive a static, idealized version of democracy, we should aim to create new forms of democratic engagement that respond to contemporary challenges. So my invitation will be not to look for quick fixes, not to aim for only restoring democratic structures, but also to reimagine the ways in which citizens, communities, and institutions interact and participate in the public sphere.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, we will be sure to link to the PHILEA organization and Hannah Ardent's work too in the podcast description. That's a great point, because it's not a simple recipe, as you say, Sevda, but certainly not a lost cause at all. And there seems to be huge opportunity for both public and private spheres to work together. Well, thank you. Thank you so much to you both for your time and expertise. It was so wonderful to learn from you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
And listeners, tell us what you think. You can find all the information mentioned in today's episode in the podcast description, and we want to hear from you. So leave us a comment. You can find us on SoundCloud, YouTube, Spotify, and well, across our social media as well. We would really value your feedback. Thank you very much for listening.